100 feet above sea level now. Lake Champlain is 95 feet above sea level. So even though we're surrounded by mountains, we're really not that high up. Lake Champlain is 125 miles long. What gets confusing is up the lake is south because the water flows north. Though I, for the week, am going to say up is north and down is south, just so we don't get totally confused. Because technically you're going up the lake as you go south. Lake George is the same way. Lake George is, between us and that ridge of hills, is the northern end of Lake George. Lake George empties into Lake Champlain through the Lachute River, which loops around. We actually crossed it when we went through town. And the mouth of the Lachute's between us and the fort over here. So it makes a big U shape around from Lake George over. Lake George is 225 feet higher in elevation. So that river drops 225 feet in a little less than 3 miles. So from the fort, the river is navigable about a mile. And then you hit the first waterfall. And from there, it's a series of falls and rapids, which are now industrial dams built in the 19th century because of the water power. So there are still waterfalls, but the whole river was a rapid, which is why it was called La Chute by the French. Lake George is about 32 miles long. The northern end of Lake Champlain, where it empties into the Richelieu River in Saint-Jean, Quebec, is about 100 miles north of here. The southern end of Lake Champlain is about 25 miles south of here at present-day Whitehall, New York. Many of you would have driven through Whitehall on your way here yesterday. From Whitehall, it's about 23 miles overland to the Hudson River. From the southern end of Lake George, it's 12 miles overland to the Hudson River. So in the 18th century, when you're traveling by water and you have to portage between bodies of water, the preferred route as you head south from here is Lake George, because you have a small 4-mile portage and a 12-mile portage, as opposed to that big 23-mile portage at the end of Lake Champlain. But both are viable options. And hence, as the fort is built by the French during the French and Indian War, think that you're now in Canada, you're not in the English colonies. Fort Ticonderoga, by being placed where it is, blocks the invasion route coming up Lake Champlain or coming up Lake George, because those two routes come together here at the peninsula. When you're at the fort, it's hard to understand that you're actually out on a peninsula, but you can see here, when you're in the fort, Lake Champlain's on 3 sides of you. And the French expect their attack, their opponents to be coming from the south, which is why the fort is built on this side of the peninsula. And there's also a ridge at that top of it, so it's sitting on top of a ridge. The fort is about 100 feet above the level of the lake. When the French construct the fort, the British are constructing Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George. So you've got a no man's land, which is basically the length of Lake George. You can see how narrow the lake is heading south. The lake here is only about 40 feet deep. When you get to Crown Point, about 15 miles north of here, and we're going to cross Lake Champlain at the bridge there on Wednesday, from there north, the lake gets deeper and the lake gets wider. At its deepest point, Lake Champlain is almost 500 feet deep, and at its widest point at Burlington, Vermont, it's 12 miles across. Here, it's just a quarter mile from point to point. So you've got the point of the Ticonderoga Peninsula, and then the completely wooded hills over there are Mount Independence. And it would have been the opposite in the 18th century. Everything else would have been wooded, Mount Independence would have been cleared, because that's where about 2/3 of the American troops that were stationed here in 1776 are on Mount Independence. 1/3 are over on the Ticonderoga side. So particularly in 1776 and 1777, when there's references to Ticonderoga, they mean the whole complex, not necessarily the fort. One of the other things we don't always think about, if you've got soldiers stationed at Fort Ticonderoga, you think they're in the fort. Of the thousands and thousands of men who were ever stationed here, very few of them ever set foot inside the fort. There's camps everywhere, fortified camps. We're going to walk around the old French lines this afternoon, which were refortified by the Americans in 1776. All of Mount Independence was cleared. There was a second fort built there. There were shoreline batteries built up. One of the reasons the Americans fortify Mount Independence is that problem When the French built the fort, the enemy's coming from here. In 1776, the British are coming from there. And the fort doesn't really command approaches from the north very well. So by fortifying Mount Independence, they've got a great view north, like the view that Ticonderoga has facing south. So all this stuff I want to get out, and I'm trying to remember what it all is real quick.
Talk about the caisson bridge
Okay.
and all that.
One of the letters we're going to look at tomorrow is a letter from Major Percival Fraser, who's with the Pennsylvania troops. The Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey troops are on this side of the lake. The New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut troops are over there. There's a real good reason for that. They don't get along. There is actually a couple occasions where they open fire on each other. And for us, we always think of the Americans being this united front. In 1776, the concept of us still hasn't completely developed. They're all New Englanders, I'm from Connecticut, I'm from Pennsylvania. And Fraser actually, in the letter we're not going to share with you tomorrow, talks consistently in every letter to his wife how disappointed he is in the New Englanders. There's this image that's been built up in Pennsylvania how the New Englanders are leading us in this battle, and he's so disappointed. They're lazy, at least in his opinion, they're lazy, they're terrible fighters, they're unmotivated, and so much for all this great Puritan religion we hear about. But in the letter we will look at, he talks about he's over on Mount Independence and he's waiting for a boat to get back to this side. So they're using bateaus, which are like pickup trucks. They're flat-bottom boats. They range from 25 to 35 feet in length. And they'd be using those to get back and forth. Well, when you've got, by the late fall of 1776, over 10,000 troops here, it's a hassle shifting back and forth. So they build a bridge connecting the 2 points that's built originally as a footbridge in the fall of 1776. And over the winter, they sink 22 caissons, think 10 by 10 log cabin type things, where they just use the ice, cut the holes in the ice, the log will float, you put another log on, the weight sinks it down a little bit, another log, and it slowly sinks in, and every several feet of layers they put boards across, put stones on it to help sink it further. And so the way they built these caissons to get down to 40 feet in the middle is they build them on top of the ice and slowly sink them down. When the ice goes out in the spring of 1777, they attach a floating bridge to the side that's wide enough for carts to go across, and the plan is to eventually build a permanent bridge across the caissons, not just attached to the side of them. Of course, John Burgoyne and the British have different plans. That never happens. During the evacuation, which we'll talk about later, but during the evacuation in 1777, which yesterday was the anniversary of, July 6, 1777, the Americans on this side evacuate across and head south. They leave an artillery crew on the Vermont side, the Mount Independence side, to blow up the bridge when they're all crossed. Well, what are you going to do while you wait hours for people to leave? Well, there's all this rum, you just can't leave for the British. So when the British cross the bridge, they find the artillery crew passed out with a loaded cannon, with a lighted linstock, which is what you use to fire off the cannon. So the bridge isn't destroyed until the British evacuate in November of 1777. So that, of the 22 caissons that were sunk about 25 years ago, underwater archaeology, they identified 21. Wow. One's missing. That's in the middle, which is probably removed because of its impact on steamboat traffic in the 19th century. So doing underwater archaeology in this part of the lake is very tricky because it's a very clay sedimenty bottom, so visibility is not very good. You get up into the deeper lake, visibility is great. You can see great distances underwater. Let's see. One other point that's going to come in the evacuation in 1777. On the far side of Mount Independence, you can see a creek, and you can see how it wanders off to the southeast, and it keeps going and going and going. Burgoyne's plan in 1777 was to completely surround Ticonderoga and Mount Independence and force the Americans to surrender. Getting cannon up here was just part of the plan, and if it was just for the cannon here, the Americans probably wouldn't have evacuated. We're at the outside range of artillery. They can hit the fort, but it's going to be hit and miss. It's not real accurate. They can kind of harass Mount Independence. But Burgoyne has an army of about 9,000 men. Half of them are British, They land on this side of Lake Champlain. The other half are German, and they land on that side of Lake Champlain. And the Germans are supposed to loop around, and you can see a road heading south from Mount Independence. That's pretty much the site of the military road in 1777. The Germans are supposed to get to the south side of Mount Independence and cut that road off, so the Americans are stuck here. Well, East Creek creates the problem. It's very swampy. Every time the Germans tried to cross it, they had to back off and head further east. They had to go 7 miles upstream before they could cross. So that buys the Americans the time when they decide to evacuate. They still can because the Germans haven't cut off the last escape route. On Thursday morning when we're at Saratoga Battlefield, Eric Schnitzer, who's the park historian there, is going to do a talk for us late morning all about who exactly are the Germans with Burgoyne and getting beyond. You've all heard that they're Hessians. Well, they're not all Hessians. And he's going to describe who are the Hessians and who aren't Hessians and why not. And also why each group of those Germans are involved in the American Revolution. You've also heard them all called mercenaries. Well, a true definition of a mercenary is somebody who hires themselves out. Those German soldiers didn't hire themselves out. Their king, their prince, their duke hired them out. They have no choice being here. And I might be a little sensitive because one of my ancestors is one of those Hessians with Burgoyne. And he truly was a Hessian. He was from Hesse-Hanau. He's 16 years old. He didn't want to come to America. He's drafted into the Hesse-Hanau Air Prince Regiment. He comes to Montreal. He's with them. He's captured at Saratoga, hence that branch of my family's here. Because after the war, he doesn't go back, he stays here. So there's all sorts of great little stories that you can tell, but really the big point of bringing everybody up here is the sense of the geography. Because it looks totally different when we get down to the fort, but you can really tell how this is a commanding location. Even, if they could have brought larger artillery up here, it would have been even more of a problem, but as the caliber of the artillery gets bigger, the weight more than doubles. They just get bigger and bigger. He brought 9 and 12 pounders up here, which means they fire solid cannonballs that weigh 9 pounds or 12 pounds. The largest cannon at the fort is a 32 pounder. The cannon, the barrel, weighs 3 tons. That doesn't include everything else. So they're heavy. They're not easy to get around unless you're on the water. So a 32 pounder can shoot about 3 miles. And a 24 pounder, which the majority of the cannon at the fort are 24 pounders, have a range of about 2 miles, and a skilled gun crew can hit a 30-foot target, a bateau, about 1.5 miles away 6 times out of 10. So not bad. If you've got a bank of 5 cannon firing, 2 to 3 of them are going to hit the target. So they're much more accurate and much longer range than the firearms that the troops themselves are using.
When we go to Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, you'll be able to see a lot of displays, etc., on the Quezon Bridge. I have a personal fascination with it that they built this bridge here. So when you go there, if you get interested in that, there's a lot of things you can photograph and video related to that. And if you have flexibility in your schedule, when you leave, the Mount Independence, you can't see it from here, but it's tucked away in the woods. The Mount Independence Visitors Center is there, and it has a complete display of a lot of the artifacts that were taken out of the lake 25 years ago. So on your way out, you can take the cable ferry over. We just couldn't fit it into the schedule.
Okay, you are all going to get your own copy of this. It won't be laminated, but this is the Wintersmith map. The original is in our collection. It was done by a German officer in the British Army, which gets even more confusing. He's not in the German Army here. He's in the British Army, but he's German. And there's a lot of officers in the British Army who aren't British. There are occasionally, not too often, but French officers, Scandinavian officers, Scottish officers, Irish officers. But Charles Wintersmith, his real name is Carl Winterschmidt. He makes this map in the fall of 1777. And you can almost hear his commander saying, okay, here we are at Ticonderoga. We fought here in 1758. We fought here in 1759. We occupied the place from 1759 to 1775. We lost the place in 1775. We came back and tried to recapture it in 1776. We came back and finally recaptured it in 1777. We damn well better have a map the next time we have to come here. So this is an incredibly accurate map as far as the topography, the geography. He was a trained military engineer. If you overlay this on the same scale topographical map, other than some vague changes in the shoreline because of erosion over the last 240 years, it's pretty accurate. And what's on the ground today is on this map. So we're going to be looking at the French lines, the Carillon battlefield this afternoon, and these are the French lines that were refortified by the Americans in 1776 and 1777. What we see on the ground today is what the Americans did in those 2 years. And this, you can make out all the features that are on here are still there with, you know, some erosion over time. So it's a great map.
So where are we?
We are right here on the top of Mount Defiance. So the fort's off in this direction. Here's East Creek, Mount Independence here. You can see the tree line, and all this area has been cleared of trees. All this area has been cleared of trees as well. One of the ongoing challenges of 18th century maps is some maps consider this Lake Champlain all the way to the south, which we do today. Some of them consider Lake Champlain from Ticonderoga north, and this will be either Wood Creek or the river to Lake Champlain, or on this one, water from South Bay and Wood Creek is what it calls it. Other maps don't consider Lake Champlain until you get past Crown Point, where it gets deeper and wider. The USGS today considers the whole thing, like it's all the same level. But a lot of times you'll see references to crossing the river rather than crossing the lake. And in the 18th century, that's okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How far is this from Fort Ticonderoga?
We are about 1.1 miles from here to the center of the fort.
Okay.
And with artillery, well, artillery from here can shoot there. Artillery from there can't shoot here because of the change in elevation.
Yeah.
So by being about 700 feet higher, well, actually about 6,500 feet higher than the fort, it buys you that much more distance on your artillery. But everything that needs to be lugged up here has to be done. There wasn't a nice paved road. They had to create the road, they had to chop down the trees. And one of the ongoing debates in history is, why didn't the Americans fortify this position? And some American officers knew that this was a vulnerability, but if you look at it from, this place is a lot easier to capture and use to attack the fort than it is to defend. What's one of the things you need if you're going to have troops up here? Provisions, including water.
Yeah, there's no water.
Where's the water?
Yeah.
Way down there. After, you know, had the Americans put troops here to hold on to Mount Defiance, they would have delayed Burgoyne a few days, maybe a week, but eventually they'd run out of those provisions, they'd run out of water, would be the key thing, and without water, you can't hang out, you can't last very long, and St. Clair doesn't have enough troops to relieve them. He's had to pull in his troops because he doesn't have enough. We'll talk later in the week. 1776, there's over 10,000 men here. St. Clair in 1777 has 2,000, and half of them are listed as unfit for duty. So he's got 1,000 men to hold on to a post designed to be defended by 10,000 the previous year. So I always feel sorry for St. Clair. I think he's in an untenable position from the time he arrives here. He arrives here 2 weeks before the British do. So he hasn't had a lot of time on the ground, though he was here as a colonel the previous year. He was a colonel of the 6th Pennsylvania Regiment, and he was actually the officer who was given the honor on July 28th to read the Declaration of Independence to the troops for the first time. And because the 4th of July was just a couple days ago, we always bring up his quote. When he concludes his reading, he adds his own last sentence, "God save the free and independent states of America." And then that was, so we get a lot of military groups who come here studying the 77 campaign. A lot of those officers have nothing good to say about St. Clair. And I can see some of their points, but when it comes down to it, they all ask themselves, who would want to serve under him, and none of them do. All right, anybody have any questions? Okay, we're going to hop back in the bus.